So we had arrived at none other than the Hotel Tajikistan, which, as far as we could tell, was the only hotel in Dushanbe. We're talking about a capital city of a country that had been abandoned by the Soviet Union in 1993. We were there 5 years later, and turns out they were still reeling from this. They'd basically just been dumped by Moscow and said, get on with it. And the state of the country became pretty apparent over the next couple of weeks, but which I'm sure you'll understand as this story unfolds. We arrived at the hotel, and once again, we were told, look, just wait here, sit down, and wait, and can we have your passports, please? And being naive, helpful chaps, we said, yeah, sure. Eventually, after kind of thinking, not sure about that, but they said we can't go and do the job if you haven't got the right stuff in your passport. Bear in mind, we still knew very little about what was expected. We knew we were there to provide some PA systems for some sort of gatherings, but we didn't really know much more than that. So we duly handed over our passports and we sat in reception for a few hours. Could we have a cup of coffee? Niet. Could we have anything to eat? Niet. A beer? Niet. The hotel was essentially just desolate. It had been built, I suppose, for the purpose of housing the Politburo members and whatever, the KGB or the minister for, I don't know, gun cleaning. But whatever, we sat there and we waited with very little to do. And eventually our passports were returned to us. And we thought, okay, great, thanks very much. Open them up to see what the fuss was about. Bang, in there, an Afghan visa. Now, in those days, as it still is, Afghanistan was a troublesome area. Tajikistan borders Afghanistan. We didn't know that we were going to be asked to go into Afghanistan, but apparently we had to be prepared because the opportunities it turned out to go and do these events were they were going to be pretty kind of last minute arrangements. The consequences for the likes of us who work in this industry or supposedly work in this industry when the world's not ravaged by some kind of superbug, the consequences of an Afghan visa are pretty serious because it means that there are many countries, especially the United States, that won't let you in if you have an Afghan visa in your passport. Now, our clients who were looking after us obviously understood this. However, they didn't want to tell us that that's what was going on because obviously they had some commitments. They needed us. However, that was the situation. So after kind of jumping up and down a bit and saying, things like, come on, you should have told us, blah, we kind of got over it. And we were given some keys to our rooms where we basically went and waited. I would say we were in Dushanbe. I can't really remember, but I would say we were there for about 4 or 5 days. Now, this hotel was not like any other hotel that I've ever stayed in. It was essentially empty. There was no hot water, no television signal, no air conditioning. There was no beer in the bar. There was very little food. Occasionally there was some food to be had, which wasn't particularly appetizing. Like all Russian hotels, there was the obligatory gift shop in the foyer, which was a very sad affair because essentially it had very little in it. The occasional little mini bust of Lenin and stuff like that. It was a sad, desperate, lonely place, and it was roasting hot. And like I said, we had no hot water, but we did find out that there was hot water on one floor of the hotel only, but we had to persuade a babushka who sat behind a table outside the lift, which did work remarkably. And she very begrudgingly showed us where the room was with the hot water in, and we were allowed our one shower of the whole time we were staying there. It was a pretty sad affair. In the evenings, we'd sit together and chat. There was a balcony, and we'd listen to what was going on in the park across the road, which seemed to involve kids shooting at each other, which was nice. It was a fairly kind of immediate, I suppose, introduction into the state of affairs in this kind of sadly forgotten but strangely beautiful country. But the time eventually arrived for us to leave Dushanbe and travel to our base, our operations base, out in the Pamir Mountains in the small town of Kharog, which redefines the word remote. So the day came when we were due to leave to fly out to Kharog. We left from Dushanbe Airport in a small plane. I can't remember what it was, but much smaller than the Ilyushin IL-76, that was sure. We had no idea where the equipment was, but that was apparently being driven out there in trucks. And off we went, and it became apparent on the flight, much more apparent, of the nature of the country that we were going to be spending time in. As Dushanbe is on a floodplain, very flat, but very quickly there was some fairly serious mountain action as we flew out to Kharog. Now, if you look at a map, Kharog is on the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and which is defined by the ridge of the Pamir Mountains. And the town itself, well, we landed there on sort of an airstrip and arrived in this small town, which was nestling in this incredible valley, surrounded by massive mountains with a sapphire blue river running through it. Apparently the reason why it was that colour is because of the minerals that just come spewing out of the mountains. And it turns out that rubies are something that are mined in Tajikistan, and amongst lots of other things. Again, more of which later. And we were shown to our accommodation, which was essentially an apartment, and with nothing in it really. And we were left there, and we were told to wait, which we did. But we went exploring, obviously, and we very quickly discovered that Kharog is not exactly your ideal destination if you are looking for fun times and fabulous food and exotic cocktails, because there is very little of that. The food itself, the vegetables, the fruit and vegetables, was all pretty amazing because it's all fresh and it was grown in these beautiful fertile valleys. And there was a market where that was being sold along with lamb and goat, which was it was colourful and probably the most colourful aspect of it. The people there, I read recently, survive on less than something like $25 a week, and some of those that are actually less than $5 a week. It was my first ever exposure to real kind of baseline poverty, but there was a very simple beauty about the whole thing. There was a peace and tranquility that I found really kind of, well, it moved me actually, and it's one of the things that has stayed with me ever since. This was 22 years ago we did this, something like that, I can't remember. It was late 90s anyway. Karog, we did actually find some beer. We bought the last 4 beers in the town, it turned out. And daily we'd go down to it was kind of, I think it was the United Nations office. There was a lot of peacekeeping going on because there'd been a civil war just before we arrived there, and the Russians in their war against the Taliban were, which was over, but they were still everywhere, and there's apparently still a lot of tension between them, and it was a situation that none of us had ever really been in before, and we began to discover more about the reason we were there, and it turns out that the large majority of the population in that part of the world are Muslims from the Ismaili sector of Islam, and their religious leader is the Aga Khan. Now, the Aga Khan, you may have heard of. He's a very wealthy, apparently Swiss businessman who owns racecourses and things. But the Aga Khan Foundation is primarily in place to support his people, the Ismaili people who live in Tajikistan, Afghanistan, China, Kyrgyzstan. And he was he was coming to Tajikistan to actually speak to his people, and we were there to provide the PA systems for the quite sizable gatherings in various places around the southwestern part of Tajikistan where it bordered Afghanistan. And it became apparent that the importance of this to the local people was immense. And we had a great responsibility to make sure that these things went as smoothly as possible. But first you have to understand some of the difficulties involved in actually making these things happen. All of the rally sites, where these rally gathering sites, were in really remote places. And, obviously power was an issue. Stages were an issue. But it turned out that if there was no stage to be had, they'd build one out of rock and mud and face it with marble that they'd hewn and polished from the local mountains. Stunning, absolutely stunning dedication and craftsmanship, just beautiful. And people had been apparently walking for weeks to actually arrive at these places and to come and see and hear their religious leader. It was explained to us that there were probably, I think, maybe 6 or 7 sites where he was going to visit, and they were all spread out in quite sort of extreme locations from one end of the sort of southwest of the border to the other. And it was decided that we should go and survey as many of these as possible. And between the three of us, we really thought we should decide how to handle this. So we thought that one of us should go and survey them and come back with the site plans, if there were such things, while the other two actually went through the equipment and found out what it was we had to play with. I got the long straw. I was the one who shot off in one of the Aga Khan's helicopters to all these places, and and go and have a look, which was a stunning experience. We spent a lot of time in helicopters, but this was just extraordinary. The Aga Khan's helicopters were pretty cool. They were, painted and liveried and all of that sort of thing. And we'd arrive in these remote villages like Vanj and Bartang and Ishkashim, and we land in this Aga Khan helicopter, and they'd all thought, "Oh, it's him! He's come!" And there'll be thousands of people all gathering around. When we the most remote, I think the most remote of all was a place called Ishkashim, where we landed, and most of these people, they hardly ever see Westerners, let alone sound engineers. But we'd land there in a group of us and check out the site, and they'd show us around, and the amount of work that'd been put into these places was phenomenal. The one in Ishkashim was the size of probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 football pitches, and it had been levelled by hand, covered in stones that had all been graded, and then it had all been divided off by more stones, which were really high crystalline content marble. So the white lines, if you like, were actually marble, and the sun was really strong, and it all glittered in the sunlight. It was just amazing. On arrival for the survey in Ishkashim, we met the local village elders, and we were having a meeting by what looked like an orchard with some goats in it. And I thought, goats, I like goats, And we were talking away, and obviously I didn't really understand a lot of what was being said. They were either speaking Tajik or Russian. But I noticed one guy at one point was sort of standing at the back of the group of people, moving around shiftily, and I happened to glance. He was holding something behind his back, and I happened to glance at it, and it was actually the head of a goat that was dripping flesh blood onto the road. And I thought, oh, that's, don't see that every day. And at the same time, in the building behind us, which I think was the mosque, there was a strong smell of cooking and sort of, smoke belching out of a chimney. And I thought, oh, interesting. Turned out that to honour us arriving at Ishkashim, they'd slaughtered one of the goats, and they laid out this feast on these beautiful blankets down by the river, and we sat and talked, sort of, and had freshly slaughtered goat, which was amazing. It was absolutely incredible, and there were certain parts of the goat which are considered more worthy than others, and we were invited to eat these. I think it was basically the offal. It was wonderful. It was great, although it did actually make things rather difficult the following day when I was back in Karog, waiting for a helicopter to fly off somewhere else, and I was suddenly caught short. But we don't need to go into those details. Just to say that if you have no toilet paper on those occasions, and the only thing to hand is an obsolete Russian helicopter repair manual, you have to do what you have to do.